Welcome to the 5th episode of The Mist by Stephen King. Hope you'll enjoy the journey. The storage area, problems with the generators, what happened to the bag boy. I sat down on the floor and took Billy on my lap and held his face against my chest and rocked him and talked to him. I told him all the lies parents keep in reserve for bad situations, the ones that sound so damn plausible to a child, and I told them in a tone of perfect conviction.
That's not regular fog,
Billy said. He looked up at me, his eyes dark circled with tear streaked.
Isn't it, Daddy?
No, I don't think so. I didn't want to lie about that. Billy started to doze off. When I was sure he was solidly out, I laid him on the floor and went looking for something to cover him up with. There were few people in the aisles, wandering like ghosts, their faces greasy with shock. I went into the storage area with a big double door between the meat cabinet and the beer cooler. The generator roared steadily behind its plywood partition, but something had gone wrong. I could smell diesel fumes, and they were much too strong. I walked towards the partition, taking shallow breaths. At last, I unbuttoned my shirt and put part of it over my mouth and nose. The storage area was narrow, feebly lit by two sets of emergency lights. Cartoons were stacked everywhere. Bleach on one side, cases of soft drinks on the far side of the partition, stacked cases of beefaroni and catsup. One of those had fallen over and the cardboard carton appeared to be bleeding. I unlatched the door in the generator partition and stepped through. The machine was obscured and drifting, oily clouds of blue smoke. The exhaust pipe ran out through a hole in the wall. Something must have blocked off the outside end of the pipe. There was a simple on-off switch and I flipped it. The generator hitched, bletched, coughed and died. Then it ran down in a diminishing series of popping sounds that reminded me of Norton's stubborn chainsaw. The emergency light faded out and I was left in complete darkness. I got scared very quickly and I got disoriented. My breathing sounded like a low wind rattling in straw. I bumped my nose on the flimsy plywood door going out and my heart lurched. There were windows on the double doors, but for some reason they were painted black and the darkness was nearly total. I got off course and ran into a stack of bleach cartoons. They trembled and fell. One came close enough to my head to make me step backward, and I tripped over another cartoon that landed behind me. I fell down, thumping my head hard enough to see the bright stars in the sky. Good show. I stood up carefully, looking for a pencil line of light between the double doors. I found it, a faint but unmistakable scratch on the darkness. I started toward it, and then I stopped. There was a sound, a soft sliding sound. It stopped, then started again with a sleety little bump. Everything inside me went loose. I regressed magically to 4 years of age. That sound wasn't coming from the market. It was coming from behind me, from outside, from where the mist was. Something that was slipping and sliding and scrapping over the cinder blocks, and maybe looking for a way in. Or maybe it was already in, and it was looking for me. Maybe in a moment I would feel whatever was making that sound was on my shoe, or on my neck. It came again. I was positive it was outside, but that didn't make it any better. I told my legs to go, and refused the order. Then the quality of the noise changed. Something rasped across the darkness and my heart leaped in my chest and I lunged at that thin vertical line of light. I hit the door straight on and burst through into the market. 3 or 4 people were outside the double doors. Only Weeks was one of them. And they all jumped back in surprise. "Did you hear it?" I asked. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, high and squeaking. "Did any of you hear it?" They hadn't heard anything. Of course, they had come up to see why the generator has gone off. As Oli told me that, one of the bag boys bustled up with an armload of flashlights. He looked from Oli to me curiously. "I turned the generator off," I said, and explained why. I could see the way they were looking at me. They didn't want any more bad news, anything else frightening or off-killer. There was enough of that already. Only Oli looked as if he believed. "Let's go and start it up again," said the bad boy, handing out the flashlights. Oli took it doubtfully. The bad boy offered me one, a slightly contemptuous shine in his eyes. He was maybe 18. After a moment's thought, I took the light. I still needed something to cover Billy with. Oli opened the doors and chalked them, letting in some light. The bleach cartoons lay scattered around the half-open door in the plywood partition. The two men and Oli went inside the generator compartment. Shadows, made twisted and monstrous by the shifting, conflicting flashlight beams bobbed on the walls. The generator ticked irregularly as it cooled. The bad boy was walking toward the loading door, flashing his light ahead of him. "I wouldn't go over there," I said. "No, I know you wouldn't. Try it, Oli," one of the men said. "Jesus, shut it down!" The generator died again. The bad boy walked back from the loading door just as they came out. "Something's plugged that exhaust, all right?" one of the men said. "I'll tell you what," said the bad boy. His eyes were shining in the glow of the flashlights. "Get it running long enough for me to raise the loading door back there. I'll go around and clear away whatever it is."
Norm, I don't think it's a very good idea.
Oli said doubtfully.
Is it an electric door?
That one called Jim said.
Sure, but I don't think it's a very good idea.
That's okay. I'll do it.
No, you don't understand.
Oli began again.
I really don't think that anyone should.
Don't worry.
He said indulgently to Oli, dismissing him. All at once, by some magic, they had gotten round to arguing about who was going to do it instead of whether or not it should be done at all. But of course, none of them had heard that nasty slithering sound. "Stop it!" I said loudly. They looked round at me. "You don't seem to understand, or you are trying as hard as you can not to understand. This is no ordinary fog. Nobody has come into the market since it hit. If you open that loading door and something comes in..." "Something like what?" Norm said with perfect 18-year-old macho contempt. "Whatever made the noise I heard."
Mr. Drayton, pardon me, but I'm not convinced that you heard anything. I know you're a big-shot artist with connections in New York and Hollywood and all, but that doesn't make you any different from anyone else, at least in my book. Way I figure you got in here in the dark and maybe you just got a little confused.
Jim said. "Maybe I did," I said. "And maybe if you want to start screwing around outside, you ought to start by making sure that lady got home safe for her kids." "Hey," Jim's buddy said. "When any of us here wants our advice, we'll ask for it." Hesitantly, Oli said.
The generator really isn't that important, you know. The food on the cold cases will keep for 12 hours or more with absolutely no...
Okay, you're it, kid.
Jim said brusquely.
I'll start the motor, you'll raise the door so that the place doesn't stink up too bad. Me and Myron will be standing by the exhaust outflow. Give us a yell when it's clear.
"Oh, this is crazy," I said.
Listen, Mr. Drayton.
Jimmy said and smiled at me coldly.
I'll tell you what. If you've got anything else to say, I think you better count your teeth first, because I'm tired of listening to your crap.
Oli looked at me, plainly frightened. I shrugged. They were crazy, that was all. Their sense of proportion was temporarily gone. Out there they had been confused and scared. In here was a straightforward mechanical problem, a bulky generator. It was possible to solve this problem. Solving the problem would make them feel less confused and helpless. Therefore, they would solve it. Jim and his friend decided I knew when I was licked and went into the generator compartment.
Ready, Norm?
Jim asked. He looked at us, and suddenly his face was much younger than 18. It was the face of a boy. His Adam's apple popped convulsively, and I saw that he was scared green. He opened his mouth to say something. I think he was going to call it off, and then the generator roared into life again. And when it was running smoothly, Norm lunged at the button to the right of the door and it began to rattle upward on its dual steel tracks. The emergency lights have come back on when the generator started. Now they dimmed down as the motor which lifted the door sucked away the juice. The shadows ran backward and melted. The storage area began to fill in with the mellow white light of an overcast late winter day. I noticed that odd acrid smell again. The loading door went up 2 feet, then 4. Beyond, I could see a square cement platform outlined around the edges with a yellow stripe. The yellow faded and washed out in just 3 feet. The fog was incredibly thick. Tendrils of mist as white as fine as floating lace eddied inside. The air was cold. It had been noticeably cold all morning long, especially after the sticky heat of the last 3 weeks. But it had been a summery coolness. This was cold. It was like March. I shivered and I thought of Steph. The generator died. Jim came out just as Norm ducked under the door. He saw it. So did I. So did Ollie. A tentacle came over the far lip of concrete loading platform and grabbed Norm around the calf. My mouth dropped wide open. Ollie made a very short glottal sound of surprise. The tentacle tapered from a thickness of a foot the size of a grass snake at the point where it had wrapped itself around Norm's lower leg to a thickness of maybe 4 or 5 feet where it disappeared into the mist. It was slate grey on top, shading to a fleshy pink underneath, and there were rows of suckers on the underside. They were moving and writhing like hundreds of small, puckering mouths. Norm looked down. He saw what had him. His eyes bulged. "Get it off me! Hey, get it off me! Christ! Get this frigging thing off me!" Norm grabbed the bottom edge of the loading door and yanked himself back in. The tentacle seemed to bulge, the way your arm will when you flex it. Norm was yanked back against the corrugated steel door. His feet clacked against it. The tentacle bulged more, and Norm's legs and torso began to slip back out. The bottom edge of the loading door scraped the shirt tails out of his pants. He yanked savagely and pulled himself back into the man, doing a chin-up. "Help me!" he was sobbing. "Help me, you guys! Please, please!" I was the closet, and I grabbed Norm around the waist and yanked as hard as I could, rocking on my heels. For a moment we moved backward, but only for a moment. It was like stretching a rubber band or pulling taffy. The tentacle yielded and gave up its basic grip, not at all. The 3 more tentacles floated out of the mist towards us. One curled around Norm's flapping red federal apron and tore it away. It disappeared back into the mist with the red cloth curled in its grip. The other 2 tentacles slittered aimlessly back and forth on the loading platform, for a moment making those slow scrapping sounds I had heard earlier. Then one of them slapped against Norm's left hip and slipped around it. I felt it touch my arm. It was warm and pulsing and smooth. I think now that if it had gripped me with the suckers, I would have gone into the mist too. But it didn't. It grabbed Norm, and the 3rd tentacle ringletted his other ankle. Now he was pulled away from me. "Help me!" I shouted. "Ollie, someone, give me a hand here!" But they didn't come. I don't know what they were doing, but they didn't come. I looked down and saw the tentacle around Norm's waist walking into his skin. The suckers were eating him where his shirt had pulled out of his pants. Blood, as red as his missing apron, began to seep out of the trench the pulsing tentacle had made for itself. I banged my head on the lower edge of the partly raised door. Norm's legs were outside again. One of his loafers had fallen off. A new tentacle came out of the mist, wrapped its tip firmly around the shoe, and made off with it. Norm's finger clutched at the door's lower edge. He had it in a death trap. His fingers were livid. He was not screaming anymore. He was beyond that. His head whipped back and forth in an endless gesture of negation, and his long back hair flew wildly. I looked over his shoulder and saw more tentacles coming. Dozens of them, a forest of them. Most were small, but a few were gigantic, as thick as moss corseted tree that had been lying across the driveway that morning. The big ones had candy pink suckers that seemed the size of manhole covers. One of these big ones struck the concrete loading platform with loud and rolling throat sound and moved sluggishly towards us like a great blind earthworm. I gave a gigantic tug, and the tentacle holding Norm's right calf slipped a little. That was all. But before it re-established its grip, I saw that the thing was eating him away. One of the tentacles brushed delicately past my cheek and then wavered in the air, as if debating. I thought of Billy then. Billy was lying asleep in the market by Mr. McAvey's long white meat cooler. I had come in here to find something to cover him up with. If one of those things got hold of me, there would be no one to watch out for him except maybe Norton. So I let go of Norm and dropped to my hands and knees. I was half in and half out, directly under the raised door. A tentacle passed by on my left, seeming to walk on its suckers. It attached itself to one of Norm's bulging upper arms, paused for a second, and then slid around its coils. Now Norm looked like something out of a madman's dream of snake charming. Tentacles twisted him uneasily almost everywhere, and they were all around me as well. I made a clumsy leaf frog, jumped back inside, landed on my shoulder and rolled. Jim, Ollie and Myron were still there. I grouped on the floor and picked up the first thing that came into my hand, a box of snowy bleach, and chucked it at Jim. It hit him in the gut just above the belt buckle. He grunted and grabbed at himself. His eyes flickered back into some semblance of normality. He didn't move. Instead, he began to defend himself, apparently having decided that with Norm being eaten alive by some insane horror from the mist, the time had come for rebuttals. Then Ollie moved, bunting him inside with one thick shoulder and plunging into the generator room. Jim stumbled over one of the bleach cartoons and fell down. His red hair had tumbled over his brow. His cheeks were cheese white. His eyes were those of a horrified little boy. Seconds later, the generator coughed and rumbled into life. I turned back to the loading door. Norm was almost gone, yet he clung grimly with one hand. His body boiled with tentacles, and blood tapered serenely down on the concrete in dime-sized droplets. His head waved back and forth, and his eyes bulged with terror as they stared off into the mist. Other tentacles now creeped and crawled over the floor inside. There were too many near the button that controlled the loading door to even think of approaching it. One of them closed around a half-liter bottle of Pepsi and carried it off. Another slipped around a cardboard cartoon and squeezed. The cartoon ruptured, and rolls of toilet paper, 2 packs of Delsey wrapped in cellophane, geared upward, came down and rolled everywhere. Tentacles seized them eagerly. One of the big ones slipped in. Its tip rose from the floor, and it seemed to sniff the air. It began to advance towards Myron, and he stepped mincingly away from it, his eyes rolling madly in their sockets. A high-pitched little moan escaped his slack lips. I looked around for something, anything at long enough to reach over the questioning tentacles and punch the shut button of the wall. I saw a janitor's push broom leaning against a stack up of beer cases and grabbed it. Norm's good hand was ripped loose. He thudded down onto the concrete loading platform and scrabbled madly for a grip with his one free hand. His eyes met mine for a moment. They were hellishly bright and aware. He knew what was happening to him. Then he was pulled, bumping, rolling into the mist. There was another scream, choked off. Norm was gone. I pushed the tip of the broom handle onto the button and the motor whined. The door began to slide back down. It touched the thickest of the tentacles first, the one that had been investigating in Myron's direction. It indented its hide skin, whatever, and then pierced it. A black goo began to spurt from it. It writhed madly, whipping across the concrete storage area like an obscene bullwhip, and then seemed to flatten out. A moment later, it was gone. Others began to withdraw. There was no sound except the roar of the generator and Ollie crying inside the plywood compartment. I could see him sitting on a stool in there with his face clutched in his hands. Then I became aware of another sound, the soft, slithery sound I had heard in the dark. Only now the sound was multiplied tenfold. It was the sound of the tentacles swarming over the outside of the loading door, trying to find a way in. Myron took a couple of steps towards me. "Look," he said. "You got to understand." I looped a fist at his face. He was too surprised to even try block it. It landed just below his nose and mashed his upper lip into his teeth. Blood flowed into his mouth. "You got him killed!" I shouted. "Did you get a good look at it? Did you get a good look at what you did?" "Look," he kept saying. "Look, look." Then I punched him low in the stomach and the air went out of and it didn't say look anymore. I don't know how long I would have gone on punching him, but someone grabbed my arms. I jerked free and turned around. I hope it was Jim. I wanted to punch him too, but it wasn't Jim. It was Oli. His round face stayed pale, except for the dark circles around his eyes that were still shiny from his tears.
Don't, David,
He said.
Don't hit him anymore. It doesn't solve anything.
Jim was standing off to one side. His face was a bewildered blank. I kicked a cartoon of something at him. It stuck one of his dingo boots and bounced away. You two idiots got that kid killed. Jim looked down at his dingo boots. Myron sat on the floor and held his beer belly. I was breathing hard. The blood was roaring inside my ears and I was trembling all over. I sat down on a couple of cartoons and put my head down between my knees and gripped my legs hard just above my ankles. I sat that way for a while with my hair in my face, waiting to see if I was going to black out or puke or what. After a bit, the feeling began to pass and I looked up at Oli. His pinky ring flashed subdued fire in the glow of emergency lights. Okay, I'm done, I said dully.
Good. We have got to think what to do next.
The storage area was beginning to sting of exhaust again. Shut the generator down, that's the first thing. Yeah, let's get out of here, Myron said. His eyes appealed to me. I'm sorry about the kid, but you got to understand. I don't got to understand anything. You and your buddy go back into the market, but you wait right there by the beer cooler. And don't say a word to anybody. Not yet. They went willingly enough, huddling together as they passed through a swinging doors. Oli killed the generator, and just as the light started to fail, I saw a quilted rug, the sort of thing movers used to pad breakable things, flopped over a stack of returnable soda bottles. I reached up and grabbed it for Billy. There was the shuffling, blundering sound of Oli coming out of the generator compartment. Like a great many overweight men, his breathing had a slightly heavy whistling sound.
David, you still there?
His voice wavered a little. Right here, Oli. You want to watch out for all those bleach cartoons?
Yeah.
I guided him with my voice and in 30 seconds or so, he reached out of the dark and gripped my shoulder. He gave a long, trembling sigh.
Christ, let's get out of here. The dark is bad. The dark is bad.
It is. But hang tight a minute, Oli. I wanted to talk to you and I didn't want those two idiots listening.
Dave, they didn't twist Norm's arm. You ought to remember that.
Norm was a kid, and they weren't. But never mind, that's over. We've got to tell them, Oli, the people in the market.
If they panic?
Oli's voice was doubtful. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But it will make them think twice about going out, which is what most of them want to do. Why shouldn't they? Most of them will have people they left at home. I do myself. We have to make them understand that they are risking if they go out there. His hand was gripping my arm hard. All right, he said.
Yes, I just keep asking myself. All those tentacles? Like a squid or something? David, what were they hooked to? What were those tentacles hooked to?
I don't want those two telling people on their own. They will start a panic. Let's go. I looked around and after a moment or two located the thin line of vertical light between the swing doors. We started to shuffle toward it, wary of scattered cartoons. One of Oli's pudgy hands clamped over my forearm. It occurred to me that all of us had lost our flashlights. As we reached the doors, Oli said flatly,
What we saw, it's impossible, David. You know that, don't you? Even if a van from Boston's Sea Aquarium drove out back and dumped out one of those gigantic squids, like in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it would die. It would just die.
Yes, that's right, I said.
So what happened, huh? What happened? What is that damned mist?
Oli, I don't know. We went out. Thank you for listening to the 5th episode of The Mist by Stephen King. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel for more.